and welcome to this session of the forum. We're quite happy to have you today. We hope all of you made it on time, and we hope you're all excited to hear to today's presentation. The theme of today is internet infrastructure, political and ethical consequences of the internet, with a focus also on the theory of the commons and how the theory of the commons can be applied to the internet infrastructure. I guess I'm not sure. We'll see about that. The first commenter is going to be Nicolò Barca, which is then going to be followed, I guess, by Antonino Esposito. I'm not sure Elvira is going to make it on time. Elvira is going to make it on time. She had some problems, but we'll see. In case she won't make it, we're going to have more time for discussion. So just as a reminder, as usual, it's half an hour presentation, and then we have some time to start a quick debate, discussion, questions, and so let's start with Nicolò. Please, Nicolò, the floor is yours. You're online.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, I'm Nicolò Barca. I'm a master's student here at Goldsmiths University. I study political communications, and today we thought we're kind of a bit out of the boundaries, really, of the subject we've been given, but it obviously has a lot to do with it in its own way. So personally, what I'll be looking at, the title of my talk is going to be The Origins of Techno-Utopianism in the American Counterculture. So what I'm going to be looking at really is an attempt at understanding the narrative, the ideology of the internet that has ruled its making, its creation, its development in the last 40 years, really, since its existence. And there's an interesting time for this, and especially this is important because then my colleague, I believe, will be talking about the negative sides, potentially, of internet, where I'll be looking at the origins of the positivism behind the internet. And it has become fashionable today. Journalists have even invented a term for it, which is called techlash, which is essentially the idea to criticize the world of ICTs, of internet, of information and communication technologies. And we have all come these days, especially after the sort of Facebook scandal, if so we can call it, to debate about its dystopic potentialities of the systems of control that it can harness and its dehumanizing effect. Yet, this is not something new. In fact, our story really begins all the way back in the summer of 1964 with the free speech movement, when hundreds of students at Berkeley in California, Berkeley University, protested against the government that they felt was treating them like bits of abstract data. For them, you know, the massive computers that filled the rooms of IBM, of the Defense Department, of the research centers at MIT and Harvard, and the networks which the government was setting up were considered technologies of dehumanization, of centralized bureaucracy, and an attempt at rationalizing social life. Now, if we read these terms today in an op-ed on The Guardian by critic of information technologies like Morozov, we would not be surprised. And yet, as we have seen, these are words which are nearly slightly older than 50 years old. Now, for a long period in between our criticism today and the criticism of the early 60s, among academic and entrepreneurial circles, on the mouth of TED Talk speakers, on the pages of Wired, in the political meetings of exponents and members of the Five-Star Movement or the pirate parties across Europe, the internet has become the technology that can change the world into a better place. Academics, journalists, politicians, everyone began seeing in it the great solution. You know, and it's not only that it will stop crime, like Minority Report, but it will create the global communities that Zuckerberg is so fond of. It will export democracy, as so many commentators of the Arab Spring thought it had done after the revolutions in 2011. Some even say it will substitute nation states. But it is also that they will destroy hierarchies, they will devolve and distribute power, but they will allow all of us to be what we want, to develop our consciousness. And if issues arise on the way of this brave new world, well, there's no need to worry because the internet will solve them. Now, this particular mentality is what Morozov called solutionism. And solutionism is the idea that problems created by technology can be solved by technology, and so there is no real issue. But how did this evolution happen? How did we get here? And where do the views that have shaped the policies of the information era come from? So today I will be running a sort of quick timeline based, among other sources, on a book by Fred Turner, who is a professor at Stanford University, and it was written in what I really consider quite a unique book called From Counterculture to Cyberculture. And this is a relatively recent area of research for me, so bear with me if it's still confused, and it would be great to hear your opinion once I'm finished. But I find it quite fascinating how the history, or even better, the historiography of the internet, this global system that permeates, or for others invades our lives, is subject to so little debate. Are we ever taught anything about it? We all know who Gutenberg is, but do we know who Timothy Berners-Lee is? Do you know who Stuart Brand is? Do we know what the ARPANET was? I know I didn't before I studied, and I think it's a debate we should start having. So to understand this process, we have to understand what seem like two separate entities, but which in fact have influenced each other in ways which have crafted the internet as we have come to know it. The first is the military-industrial complex that came out of the Second World War. And the second is the counterculture of the 1960s and its cultural ramifications. So I will briefly outline the first, then move on to the second, because the parallel is an interesting one. After all, we must realize that the same military-industrial research world that created nuclear weapons and computers also gave rise to a new type of workplace, a new type of work. Interdisciplinary, freewheeling, entrepreneurial, harnessing the potential of individuals, but also collectively shaped. In the research laboratories, in the engineering projects, scientists, military personnel, technicians, they broke down the bureaucratic and geographical barriers that had kept them apart and collaborated like they had never done before. Now that might sound familiar to someone, because at least in my mind, it sounds a lot like the problem-solving collective intelligence that this forum envisions. And it's not a coincidence that we now imagine it through the internet. It's not a coincidence that we are here connected by the internet. For these people embraced and embodied the cybernetic vision of systems, networks, and information which the internet would later bring to the outer world, to the common people. And I quote Turner here. These people began to imagine institutions as living organisms, social networks as webs of information, and the gathering and interpretation of information as keys to understanding not only the technical, but also the natural and social worlds. Now, we leave this world temporarily aside, because in the same years, in the same country, breathing the same Cold War air and living in the same brainwashed fear of nuclear fallout, two overlapping but ultimately distinct social movements were born out of the youth movements of the 60s. The first rapidly came to be known as the New Left. These were the disenfranchised voters that searched for new avenues for their political activism, and we identify them in our visual memory as the protesters of the Vietnam War, for example, or the Civil Rights Movement. The second instead was born out of new cultural manifestations, the beat culture, Zen Buddhism and Eastern philosophy, and later psychedelic drugs. Now, while the first looked outwards to political action, the second looked inwards. Sorry, my battery is dying. And the second looked inwards towards questions of consciousness and interpersonal intimacy, and used tools, this is how they considered them, like LSD and music, to enhance them and to achieve them. Now, the way they saw it, these goals were in fact only the means by which they could create alternative, egalitarian communities that could replace the society, the stifling, hierarchical, and bureaucratic society that they were challenging. In fact, our popular knowledge, the culture has kept for us regarding the 60s, remains hinged to things like the Summer of Love of San Francisco, the drugs, the music, Woodstock, the failure of that generation which Hunter Thompson describes in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. But nobody knows that in those same years, or at least few people know that in those very same years, nearly 750,000 people left their normal lives to go and create more than 10,000 communes nationwide. Communes that were built around political, religious, or sexual orientations, that were all in stark opposition to the world that surrounded them, and connected by a number of shared beliefs. Now, one of these beliefs was spelled out by a man called Stuart Brand. He's a name to keep in mind. And he spelled them out in a journal called the Whole Earth Catalogue. Now, the latter was born in Menlo Park, and some bells can begin to ring. I don't know how many of you know Menlo Park are the headquarters of Facebook. They were born in 1969 as a small toolkit for the new communalists, as we're going to call those who left for the communes. But by 1971, this project had become 450 pages long. It had sold more than 1 million copies that year and had won the National Book Award. As a project born to be stashed alongside books on Eastern philosophy inside the tents of the new communists, it came to be found in bookstores across the country, stashed in the libraries of academics, in the research centers, in the houses of entrepreneurs and civil servants, next to manuals on systems theory and nuclear science. On the back cover of one number in 1971 was a message, and it read, "Stay hungry, stay foolish." And again, more bells should begin to ring. But let's not rush ahead. For it is on the pages of the Whole Earth Catalogue that our two worlds begin to meet. And this is not by chance. The catalogue was not intended merely as a manual of tools for the emerging communes, but it was imagined as a forum, a sort of textual network between communalists, technologists, academics, artists, and so on. A place where they could share information, beliefs, and hopes. In fact, what those who participated in this forum shared, though obviously coming from absurdly different angles, was, for example, the language of systems theory, cybernetics, interdisciplinary and networked approaches to the world's problems, and the belief that these, together with the new technologies that were being created in the same times, could transform the world into a better place. Obviously, the ideas regarding what this world would be like differed, but it was the faith in the same mediums of transformation that united them. In fact, on the pages of the catalogue, alongside articles on biology and astronomy, one could find the works of a man like Buckminster Fuller, the man who coined the word synergetics, or a man like Norbert Wiener, the father of cybernetics, alongside entries on the newest Hewlett-Packard's desktop calculator. Hewlett-Packard, that we nowadays know as HP, was founded down the road from the little hippie den where Stuart Brand and his wife printed the catalogues that distributed across the country. So let's keep in mind this geographical frame of reference because it is incredibly important. But mostly what appeared on the pages of the catalogue was what so much of the narrative that shaped the ideology of the internet could be found. And I need you to keep in mind that what we saw before about more contemporary visions of the internet, or indeed such figures as Mark Zuckerberg or Larry Page, because only when we understand some aspects of the mentality of those incredibly powerful people, who to a large degree own the companies that play an increasingly essential role in our societies and personal lives, only then can we understand their modes of thought and the modes of thought of many of their contemporaries, and the modes of thought with which they grew. So let's look at some aspects of this narrative to make this parallel clear. And there is no better place to start than with the purpose of the catalogue, which was written on the inside cover of every edition. Now I'll read this for you. This is how it goes. We are as gods, and might as well get good at it. So far, remotely done power and glory, as via government, big business, formal education, church, has succeeded to the point where gross defects obscure actual gains. In response to this dilemma and to these gains, a realm of intimate personal power is developing. Intimate personal power. Power of the individual to conduct his own education, find his own inspiration, shape his own environment, and share his adventure with whoever is interested. And it ends with one phrase. Tools that aid this process are sought and promoted by Whole Earth Catalog. Now, within these words lie a number of different positions that can be found in the view of the internet that shaped its last 30 years. This goes much deeper than mere ideas of techno-optimism or indeed techno-utopianism. So, for example, we can see the birth of the idea of technology, and more specifically information technologies, as creators of intimate personal power that will slowly but inevitably overthrow that of government, big business, and so on. Now let's compare that. Remember, this is 1970, 1971. Let's compare that with the words penned by Eric Schmidt, former CEO of Google, and Jared Cohen, former State Department official, in a book they call The New Digital Age. I read, "The most significant impact of the spread of communication technologies will be the way they help reallocate the concentration of power away from states and institutions and transfer it to individuals." It's quite beautiful, isn't it? The state and the markets get together to tell the common folk that power no longer lies in the institutions they represent, but in the public they are speaking to. Or, for example, let's take the word of a man called Moises Naim, executive director, or former executive director of the World Bank. Power is shifting from corporate behemoths to agile startups, from entrenched dictators to people in town squares and cyberspace, quote unquote. When are these words from? 2013. And do they seem to work for the world we know? A world where corporate behemoths buy out agile startups the moment they become a threat to their business model. A world in so many different places turning back towards authoritarian dynamics. Or finally, even better, the words of Chris Anderson, formerly editor-in-chief of Wired, and now CEO of a robotics company. And again, what a beautiful mix of academia and personal interest. His words are, "Power has shifted from top to bottom, center to edge, then to us. The collective now controls the message." But then why have these people been so spectacularly wrong? And why, I believe, would they tell you they aren't if you confronted them with what you believe are the facts? Some could say it is private interest, and there definitely might be a part of it. You know, Chris Anderson is a good example of the incestuous relationship between those who advocate changing the world via digital technologies and those who provide those technologies for a profit. But that would be, I believe, a simplification. I believe that what instead can explain it is the cultural substratum from which these ideas have grown. And it is this that I'm trying to get at with this talk. By the way, just to drive this message an inch deeper, the man who founded Wired magazine, the greatest advocate and purveyor of this ideology, Stuart Brand, and others, a man called Kevin Kelly, which we won't get into. But let's get back to the purpose of the Whole Earth Catalogue, which I read before, because it connects well with another thing I have just mentioned. Because it is quite fair to ask yourself at this point in this conversation, wait, so these members of this counterculture, they spoke against big business. Then how did they come to be big business or to promote big business? Again, I think in the statement of purpose, we can find an element of this contradiction. It's a very interesting element. For next to its disapproval of the power of corporations, the catalogue concentrates on the end goal: to develop personal power, consciousness, education, networks, communities. And then states, tools that aid this process are sought and promoted by the Whole Earth Catalogue. This contradiction, this attempt at removing the tools from the systems they are trying to fight against, this description of technologies as neutral entities, is, according to me, the quintessential logic of the Silicon Valley. Take the comments we have just talked about. The CEO of the most powerful internet company of the world tells us that power is trickling down, no longer in the hands of a few corporate giants, but finally towards the long-waiting, deserving hands of the people. And why? Because the tools it has developed and given to the people for free make them masters of their own fortune, all equally powerful in a system that is no longer hierarchical. And these ideas were not invented to serve the purpose of these companies. Eric Schmidt does not invent such statements for his own personal gain, although there is definitely some of that too. Instead, I believe these companies and these men, their views of the world and their place in it, were shaped by these ideas and these beliefs, born out of this unique combination of the non-hierarchical leniencies of the 60s counterculture and the systems and cybernetics theories of the post-war research laboratories. Let's not forget, for example, that the word cybernetics come from the Greek kubernetes, which means steersman, a guide, or a governor. And here we need to stop for a moment. I always feel like I get into a conspirational mood when I start talking about this. Because one could ask, and it would be quite right to do so, stop a second and say, so a bunch of hippies with horizontalist ideals and taking way too much LSD went out into the communes, read a bunch of stuff from research laboratories concerning systems theory and cybernetics and technology, and what? What do these people have to do with the development of information technologies? And how do these people influence anyone from their communes out of society with their long hair and wooden shoes and bleach-dyed shirts? And here it's where it gets interesting, and where it gets even more complicated if it hasn't been enough yet. For the fact is that the ideas of the counterculture had nothing to do with the development of these technologies. After all, how could they? That development was happening at the state level through the research centers in the technological race against the Soviet Union, strong in the Enlightenment era belief that with enough information and a rational scientific method, society could be improved, run more efficiently, and to everyone's benefit. At the same time, it was happening in the financial centers, where enormous networks of information were being set up to govern and control the flows and the ebbs of the economic tides, the information regarding debt and credit of every single citizen of the United States. The very same companies, businesses that worked for the American State Department and for the Department of Defense then moved into the financial sector using the new computer and information technology. Now, this transformation, which was happening already during the 70s and which increased during the 80s, was described by a man called William Gibson, who in the early 80s described a dystopian world of control that he called cyberspace. He, in fact, invents this word. And do you remember the technologies of dehumanization, of centralized bureaucracy, the rationalization of social life against which the Berkeley students protested at the beginning of this talk? Now, these fears found a place, once again, in Gibson's writing, just as they find a place in many contemporary views today. But then something happened. And here again, our protagonists come back into the scene. For the techno-utopians of the Californian counterculture, people like Stuart Brand and many others, cyberspace should not be considered a place of control and hierarchy, but as a world that could make their dreams, their egalitarian, horizontalist dreams, come true. From the alternative world that the communalists sought, and the counterculture had sought by the consumption of psychedelic drugs, where consciousness is developed, and the corrupt hierarchies of politics and power are destroyed, and where no government could intrude, they passed to the world of cyberspace, where all these things were no longer a consequence of a chemical reaction, but real, alternative worlds made possible by technological progress. It is enough to read Steve Jobs' biography to realize just how closely connected these two worlds were. I'll say a little thing about it later. And again, let's remember the geographical area where this all happens and the history of American political thought, because just like the cowboys of the 19th century in the idea of the manifest destiny being the right of Americans to invade the land of the Native Americans in the name of progress and civilization. And just as the cowboys moved west to tame the frontiers of society, so the hippies of the 60s had moved to the frontiers of their own societies to create alternative ones. In the very same way, the cyber-utopians would create a new world in the realm of cyberspace. Now, the essence of this world was spelled out by a man called John Perry Barlow, who is the founder of the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Let's hover a second on the decision to call this the Electronic Frontier. It is no chance, as always. And an early techno-utopian, Mr. John Perry Barlow, also the man who wrote a lot of songs for the Grateful Dead, if anybody knows who they are. He wrote a piece called The Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace. I will quote this extensively because I believe it is very important. And I strongly suggest to keep in mind, during all of this, the ideas of the internet, which have governed it, and governed its inherent optimism, its inherent positivism for the last 30 years. John Perry Barlow writes, "Governments of the industrial world, you wary giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace, the new home of mind. On behalf of the future, I ask you of the past to leave us alone. You are not welcome among us. You have no sovereignty where we gather. I declare the global social space we are building to be naturally independent of the tyrannies you seek to impose on us. You have no moral right to rule us. nor do you possess any methods of enforcement we have true reason to fear. And here we have this idea of protection that the cyberspace allows you. Cyberspace does not lie within your borders. It has no borders. Do not think that you can build it as though it were a public construction project. You cannot. It is an act of nature, and it grows itself through our collective actions. And now for the most important part. And then always keep in mind the idea of technology today and the real technology that has been for the last period of time. Your legal concepts of property, expression, identity, movement, and context do not apply to us. They are all based on matter, and there is no matter here. This is February 8, 1996, written in Davos, Switzerland. Now, I will not go into this text in depth, though I strongly encourage all of you to read it. All I can do is stress just how important these words were for that particular moment in time, and how important they were in shaping the ideas of the internet for years to come. Now, this narrative was not a new one. As we have seen, it predates this text by decades. It became the central logic which defined the internet for an entire generation, the generation of Larry Page and Sergey Brin, the founders of Google, the generation of the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, and many, many more. But how? Again, how did these ideas come to pervade the debate regarding the new technologies of the internet? How did they spread this word? And with this, I will start wrapping up. For this, in my mind, finally ties up all the loose strings, maybe too many loose strings. Again, I apologize. This is a relatively recent field of research for me, one that fascinates me. For what is extraordinary about the story is the way the economic, political, and academic worlds gradually find points of contact with this countercultural world. And the way the latter, the countercultural worlds, see in these economic, political, and academic worlds the possibility to achieve their long-term goals, each using each other if you want, but also, as we have seen, sharing beliefs and ideas. And we shall see exactly what those points of contact are. Now let's start with the business world, because in some ways this is the easiest to explain. Because as we have seen earlier, the fact that the tools to achieve their goals were being produced by the business behemoths, the monopolies they were opposing, was hardly a contradiction in the mind of these visionaries, as they consider themselves and as thousands and thousands of people across the country considered them. As Barlow's Declaration of Independence indicates, there is hardly any consideration that the structures that make the internet possible are in fact in the hands of the governments and the businesses he discredits. Your legal concepts of property, expression, identity, movement, and context do not apply to us. They're all based on matter, and there is no matter here, he states. You cannot control what doesn't have a form. Also, as Stuart Brand wrote years earlier in the Whole Earth Catalogue, he wrote, "I have yet to figure out what capitalism is, but if it's what we're doing, I dig it." Typical California counterculture language. And the fact is that capitalism dig them back. Soon enough, the forums that the Whole Earth Catalogue set up to network the thousands of communities, the communes that were born around its ideas. Soon enough, these forums captured the interests of those venture capitalists, the tech stock analysts, and the communication executives, and sooner or later, as we shall see, politics and government officials, people who saw in this new wave the possibility for a popularization of their ideas, a popularization that would inevitably lead them to widen their markets and achieve more profit. And do not think that these were two distinct worlds, this of business, of hippie counterculture. They weren't. When Steve Jobs was dropping acids, LSD, in the mid-1970s, and he later considered these some of the most important experiences of his life, he was doing so in a commune founded by a man called Robert Friedland, an international financier, a venture capitalist, and an owner of mines of copper across the world. This is by no chance a single example. The revolving doors between these communities, between these worlds, were constantly on the move. And it should come as no surprise then that the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace was written by Barlow, in case you noticed, at Davos, Switzerland, during the World Economic Forum, where businessmen, academics, and politicians discuss global issues and strategies. Even more so because the business world and the countercultural world shared strong political beliefs. And here is where the world of politics enters stage. For the image of the cowboy nomad, which we sort of briefly saw before, and the image of the cyber citizen coincided with a strong wave of resurgent libertarian ideals that have been a fundamental current of American political thought. These were the years of Ronald Reagan, after all, and these new Republicans saw in this narrative of an ungoverned, stateless cyberspace an opportunity to spread their commitments to deregulating and creating small government. Of course, nobody pointed out that the massive investments in this emerging economy came from the state, that the research was funded by the state, that the infrastructure that made it possible was funded by the state. Instead, their alliance was sealed in asking for the state to disappear, to let progress take its natural course of action, to allow cyberspace and the individuals that roamed it to shape this brave new world. And maybe one could find a contemporary equivalent to these views in the tax evading policies of the great media monopolies. One does not have a lot of faith in the state if it refuses to give its share to make the state work. And maybe what counts, really, is that by the time the whole Earth catalogue had transformed itself into Wired, it became a platform for such people as a man called George Gilder, Reagan's most quoted living author and the founder of Discovery, a think tank. And as we should see, think tanks will play a fundamental role, just as they played a fundamental role for the spreading of neoliberal ideas in the 70s. A man who fights every day of his life against abortion, against same-sex marriages, and for the disappearance of the state from national affairs. Or even on the front cover of Wired, which I don't know how many of us would consider a conservative-leaning magazine. On the front cover, a Republican congressman called Newt Gingrich, a fervent libertarian who ran for president, and now a fervent Trump supporter. And with Wired, we close this circle. For none of these ideas would have found a ground to grow on without its popularization by the media and without its diffusion through the world of academia. Again, the revolving doors between these worlds are nothing short of extraordinary. We already see just how far Wired became the mouthpiece for these ideas and their advocates. But universities and think tanks played a fundamental role too. John Perry Barlow, to take one, became a fellow emeritus at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard, one of the most important think tanks in the USA, dedicated to matters of the internet and the digital world. Stuart Brand, a man who I feel I've neglected, but who I strongly encourage to discover more about, became a visiting scientist at the MIT Media Lab and a visiting professor across the country. At the same time, in a pattern that we recognize all too well in contemporary times, he was being paid generously to talk at conferences organized by Shell, Volvo, or AT&T, the telecommunications company that shares in New York a building with the NSA. Also, Stuart Brand founded the Long Now Foundation, one of many thousands of think tanks across the world, where he discusses long-term thinking with journalists like Clay Shirky, who, after ending a meeting with men like John Perry Barlow or Stuart Brand, will then write the technology section op-eds for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Or, for example, entrepreneurs like Philip Rosedale, we know best as the inventor of the virtual world of Second Life. Now, I could go on for some time, jumping around Wikipedia, clicking on the various links will lead you to an incredible network across these different worlds of people that come from the same backgrounds, that share the same ideas and beliefs regarding the future and the policies and technologies needed to shape it. Now, I'm going to wrap it up here, and open the space for any questions there might be. And I realize that some of this may have the conspirationist overtones of an Adam Curtis documentary. But what I've been trying to describe isn't really a hidden circle of people bent on ruling the world. None of this is the Rothschilds or Soros or any other Bilderberg group idea of a small bunch of people ruling the world in secret rooms. Instead, what I've been searching for are the origins and the development of what I honestly think should be considered under many aspects an ideology. And if you speak to these people, if you hear their conferences, if you see the kind of activity they are up to, then this falls nothing short of an ideology. If anything, some take it to the extreme of considering it a religion. And an ideology that has an incredible amount of power over our lives. And yet, if you think about it, and this again to eliminate the conspirational side to it, it could be worse. If we consider just how much power a man like Mark Zuckerberg has, then I have to say I'm pretty happy. It is in his hands more than it is in others. I was watching his speech to Harvard prospective students, and he essentially speaks like a naive spiritual leader who sees in his operation and in the technologies that he is fostering truly the chance to change this world and transform it into a better place. To understand that, we must not, like it is too easy to do, consider these people bad, or consider that they have long-term projects to become rulers or emperors of this world. I have no qualms about the fact that Zuckerberg much prefers to live his upper middle class life, notwithstanding the billions of dollars he makes. However, I believe that if we truly wish to understand our contemporary society and information age, its relationship with digital technologies, and the power structures behind them, then this discourse is not only important, but necessary. And I hope to be able to continue this in the future. So that's me done. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nikki. It was really interesting to me. I found your your storytelling engaging and also really knowledgeable. But I have a couple of questions for you. The first question is, because probably I didn't get it really really well. What is your main point? I mean, you were just trying to explain us how the narrative behind the technology leaders and tech companies comes from, or you were trying to go a bit farther, trying to suggest that trying to suggest that this narrative that comes from the uh, con- how did you call it, the counter movement, the
Counterculture.
pardon,
Counterculture.
exactly. Basically what you were trying to say is that the narrative that stems stemmed from the counterculture of the mid 70s not really doesn't really apply to the structure of power behind the internet.
But I think
I didn't I mean I didn't really understand what is your main point. Do you think that this narrative holds effectively, or that is just a, as you said, a narrative and not the reality? Are you trying to suggest that there is really uh, really close hierarchy behind the internet that we don't see, that is covered with this naive narrative that actually doesn't really explain how the internet, the the technology, like communication technology infrastructures work?
um, it's a combination really of the various things you have just raised. On one hand, it's a purely historical outlook at where the origins of these ideas and beliefs can be found. But what I find interesting about it, more than anything else, is that we have really allowed technology to, I think, in a way outrun our capacities to momentarily outrun our sort of ethical ideas surrounding it. And so that we have allowed it really to cross a line which I believe should have been placed time ago. I don't want to get into dystopic mindsets. I agree with you, as I know some of your ideas, that there are potentialities in the internet. But I think to understand what these potentialities are, we should stop kidding ourselves regarding the power structures and the power layers and the power assemblages of devices that govern the internet. Without doing that, we risk falling in the trap of considering this a neutral tool to be used without conscience of what lies behind it. And what I find interesting is that what I'm trying to describe isn't necessarily the narrative we all share, but mainly the narrative that the people who govern this world, or generally the people who run the companies which we now use in our daily lives, and that have unprecedented amount of powers over the companies they own, and as a consequence, over the societies in which they find themselves in.
And in your opinion, sorry.
And the only way to understand this, I think, or it's not the only way, it's one of the ways, and might even not be the right way, but I believe it's a good place to start to understand what drives the techno-utopianism, what drives the techno-determinism, what drives the optimism the uncrumbling optimism in technology and the internet, information, communication technologies as makers of a wonderful new world.
Another couple of questions. First of all, do you think that the narrative you describe stemmed from the counterculture and the work heard catalog is a positive and good narrative? What I'm trying to say, do you think that if this narrative was true, it would be a good narrative to guide the development of the new communication technologies? And the second question is whether you think what do you think the tools to positively govern the development of the new communication infrastructure are? I mean, what is the best way, in your opinion, to guide this process and to make it more coherent with the narrative that was developed during the 70s?
Okay, that's interesting. And so, was it a good narrative? I believe, as I sort of outlined, that this has the mentality, the narrative which this part of the counterculture movement, which is the one we most commonly identify with, because it's the one of the hippies and the long hair and the psychedelic drugs, in some way removed itself from ideas of collectivity, of true ideas of collectivity, which instead were being shaped by the other side of the counterculture movement, which instead followed agonistic politics and agonistic activism. It is fascinating, the continuity between the psychedelic drug world of the 60s and the cyber world that followed from it in the 70s. And I believe that to be, in some forms, a removal. And the risk is that by considering this cyber world, this cyberspace, an alternative world where we can create the future society, then we blind ourselves to the issues, everyday issues of the world that surrounds us. Personally, this is obviously only a personal consideration. It has to do with my politics and with my ideals. But while these people were in their communes creating alternative societies, and I am no one to say that that is a bad thing to do, the others were in the streets fighting for civil rights, fighting against the war in Vietnam, and consider these people hedonists who escaped political responsibilities. And so I believe that narrative, although the goals might have been interesting, the ideas of communality, of non-hierarchical politics, I mean, they have fundamental consequences for the ideas of politics that we have today. But they fool themselves if they believe that they can be achieved simply via the new tools that the information revolution would allow them to have. So this leads us to the second one, which is what those good tools would be. Now, I personally think that a good place to start, as I was sort of highlighting, is considering these issues, which I have just talked about, but also what these tools, which have the capacity, the capability of being instruments for egalitarian politics and creating worldwide communities, they have, in our recent history, only been instruments, or a majority been instruments, for the continuity of power structures and capitalism forms of market and production. And this ties the two things together. And with this, I close with this question: is the risk is that the blind faith in the technologies, this form of dependency to it, this idea that, of it as a tool that will enhance both my personal consciousness, but also the communities I strive with, the egalitarian society I'm trying to build, are not so unless we use them in that direction, unless we understand the layers of power that are behind them. The independence, the Declaration of Independence of the cyberspace is absolute nonsense. It is not matter. It doesn't have borders. What? The internet doesn't have borders. The internet is not different in China, in Russia, and and USA. The internet has no matter. What about the consequences it has on our daily lives? Does that not have matter? So the risk is that this alternate world, separated from ours, becomes a safe haven where to imagine and glorify and conceptualize, while the same structures repeat themselves and the same powers survive. So what good tools could be are, for example, allowing access to technologies for everyone, allowing same access to data to everyone, creating the systems that rule out our data, for example, more transparent, and last but not least, destroying the monopolies that are the sharks surrounded by thousands of minuscule goldfish. That's it. That's me.
Thank you very much, and I really appreciate the answer. I think we'll have time to talk about it in a different moment.
Definitely.
But it would be really cool to keep on discussing these issues, putting together our different competencies as we are doing it, as we are doing exactly right now in this forum. It's always good to have different perspectives on really difficult subjects such as the internet, that is both new and quite vast as an argument. So thank you for your contribution. Now I think we can go to Antonino's speech. I'll leave the stage to him. Good luck and thank you for your participation in the forum. I'll put you on the presentation.
Hi guys, do you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, and I will focus on the dark side of the internet instead. And okay, let's share the presentation. Where is? Okay. No. Sorry.
It has a sort of reverb. Yeah, now it's perfect.
Okay. Wait. Okay, presentation is about theoretical and practical consequence of what Konstantin Passaris, a professor of economics at the University of New Brunswick, has defined as internetization. That means the empowerment of internet technology on the new global economy and society. So here I'm presenting 3 works. The first by Shoshana Zuboff, named The Big Other, Surveillance Capitalism and the Prospects of an Information Civilization, which is an analysis of how internetization, represented by a new logic of accumulation that she refers to as surveillance capitalism, is reshaping several aspects of the society. And other 2 papers by Kozinski and Matz, which illustrate how these new forms of capitalism are actually implemented. But let's start by Shoshana Zuboff. Her reflections starts from the assumption that technology is always shaped by the institutional logics of the society in which it develops and it is used. In the market sphere, these logics are logics of accumulation. She uses the expression surveillance capitalism to identify logic of accumulation, which are founded on computer mediated, and have the aim of predicting and, more importantly, modifying human behavior to produce monetization. Of course, the main tool through which this is accomplished is the collection and the analysis of the big data, which are not an unavailable consequence of the technology, but they are a condition of such contemporary capitalistic form. Zuboff arguments her view through the analysis of two documents by Google's chief economist Hal Varian, which identifies four main uses of computer-mediated transactions. That is data extraction and analysis, new forms of contract and monitoring, personalization of the services, and continuous experimentation. And she analyzed each of these uses to shed light on the dynamics of functioning of these new surveillance capitalistic firms. So let's begin with data analysis and extraction. She suggested five main sources of data. Data from economics transactions, for example, sales or purchase of assets that people normally do. The data coming from sensors embedded within objects and place, for example, within the smartwatches. Data from corporate and governments databases, for example, banks, airlines, and so on. Data from cameras, including smartphones ones and surveillance public cameras. And finally, the data which have been referred to as data exhaust, which comprehend all little aspects of our online everydayness, ranging from Facebook's likes to search queries or music and photos shared and so on. Importantly, Google and other surveillance capitalistic firms are formally indifferent to this data. That means that it does not matter the content or the quality of this data, but it counts only the number, the quantity of this data. Okay. The main implication of such formal indifference, of course, is that the extraction of data is a one-way process, which occurs in absence of dialogue and consent, despite the facts that they are these data are expression actually of individual lives. This implies that the strategy to collect data is almost always aggressive. That means the firms start their collection without requiring permission and not caring about objection from people. An example is provided from Street View cars that were found to scan data from private Wi-Fi networks. And to analyze the data, of course, what is required, what this firm requires are visual servers increasing computational capability without increasing space and money demands, and data analysts able to perform analysis with the collected data. The second point argued by Varians involve new forms of monitoring and contract. For example, this could be the case of someone who stops paying for his cars and lender could send to his car monitoring system not to allow the car to be started. However, according to Zuboff, this vision has important consequences on the meaning of the contract, which loses its role of uncertainty solver, but is transposed within a machine process. Of course, also the development of trust between a customer and a provider loses its meaning, and also the compliance of individual to laws becomes nothing but machine determined. Clearly, these consequences are easily translated into the rising of monitoring, which leads to the privacy paradox embedded in surveillance capitalism. That is, individuals lose their privacy rights, but the surveillance capitalistic firms do not. I mean, the privacy is redistributed from people to this firm, which will keep secrets on their business and modus operandi. The personalization of service, for example, the fact that Google already knows your needs before that you do the search for Zuboff, is the opposite of the classical customer-provider relationship, in which something, for example, a legal assistance, is given in exchange of something, for example, an amount of money. This will produce asymmetries on both knowledge and power between the firms and the population. Knowledge asymmetries because the firm will know the population better of it, and the population will not deeply know anything about the firms. Also because of the privacy paradox of before. And asymmetry in powers because these services offered by surveillance capitalistic firms will be felt as primary needs. For example, when Facebook in America in 2015 crashed, many people called 911. Finally, continuous experimentation. In such scenario, the classical empirical methods of hypothesis, data collection, and analysis is overturned, and data collection and analysis occurs now in parallel. This leads to the capitalistic firm to intervene and modify in real-time behavior for monetization. Okay, now I will, let's move to the empirical part of the presentation. The first of two studies I have selected is from Kosinski and colleagues of 2012. And the main of this study is to predict demographic and psychological information by digital behavior, such as Facebook likes. The sample of the study was approximately 600 US Facebook users who gave their consent to data processing via mypersonality.com application. The actual data have been recorded as we see here, demographic information through the screening of their public profile, psychological information to some scales and tests used in normally used in psychological research, such as the Raven's matrices for the intelligence. Other information, for example, drinking or smoking habits through online service. Here is the method. We can see the Facebook like entered within a matrix made of where the rows were the subject, were the single users, and the columns were the single like. When a match between a user and a page like occurred, it was signed as a 1, 0 otherwise. This matrix was then reduced through singular value decomposition, a technique of data mining. And this matrix entered within a regression model, which was logistic for binary variable and linear for matrix variable. Here are the results. As we can see, these results are for the binary variable in terms of the area under the ROI curve. And that means the that means that what is represented here is the probability of correctly classifying two random selected objects, choosing for a variable. For example, a female in the female category and vice versa. As we can see, starting from the the model was able to predict many demographic informations of the users, also with a good accuracy. For example, the ethnicity, which was almost perfectly predicted, but also the gender and so on. Instead, here we see the results for the matrix variable expressed in terms of R Pearson correlation coefficient. And here we see for psychological factors such as intelligence, emotional stability, agreeableness, extraversion, consciousness, and openness. In light, there is also the R coefficients for test-retest reliability. As we can see, the correlation between the model prediction and test-retest reliability for psychological aspects was really close for both openness and little less, but also important for extraversion dimension of personality. Instead, the model was a good predictor of age, as we can see. Let's move to the second paper that I selected, which is from Mats and colleagues from 2017. And this paper presents 3 studies with the general purpose of investigating how tailored advertising can influence the purchase behavior. Here, individuals were selected on the basis of their openness and of their extroversion through the analysis of their Facebook profile. Thus, since as we can see, it is a reliable predictor of such aspects of individual. And purchase behavior instead is considered in terms of click-through rates, which means is the proportion of clicks normalized by the number of times an ad is seen, and the conversion rate, which is simply the number of download and installation of an app or of something else. So the first study aimed to investigate the purchase behavior individual extraversion. Thus, individuals were divided in extrovert and introvert, and received the ads of a UK beauty company coherently or uncoherently with their dimension of personality. Here we can see, of course, 2 examples, and the sample of the study was the campaign reached more than 3 million Facebook users. And here we can see the results of the linear regression, and of course for conversion rate, and we see that there is a significant interaction effect for ad type in predicting the purchase behavior of its congruent customers. Averaged across the 2 campaigns, we can see the chi-square results where people in the congruent condition, thus, I mean, introvert receiving introvert ads and vice versa, had a greater purchase rate than the opposite. Study 2 is the equivalent of the first study, but this time manipulating the openness of individuals. So also, in this case, the results of previous studies were confirmed by both the logistic model and by the chi-square analysis. This time, both click-through rates and conversion rates resulted significant. the last study aimed at investigate the effects of a tailored advertisement on a predefined population, that is, introverted people. This study used different slogans for promoting an app. Some were standard used by the app before, and others were just tailored for introverted individuals. Here we can see some two examples of these different slogans. This campaign reached more than 530,000 Facebook users. And I have reported the results for the chi-square for both click-through rates and conversion rates. And as we can see, the introverted version of the app resulted in both more clicks and more installation and download than the standard one, confirming thus the importance of personalized advertisement on purchase behavior. And thus, this study just discussed provide a clear example of what Zuboff how capitalistic surveillance capitalistic firms can easily infer and modify our beliefs and behavior through apparently simple aspects of our everyday life on internet. Thus, of course, this of course opens a debate of how free we are when we browse on the web, and how what we choose to buy is imposed by others or not. Yeah, I've chosen to talk about this theme because I think that the mean through which we can avoid to reduce ourselves into automata in someone's hand when we are online is the awareness of such dynamics. Thus, know these patterns may help us to not fall into this dynamic. And with this, I conclude my presentation. And before I finish, I want to thank Nicolò for having introduced me to Zuboff's works, which I found really, as they say, food for thought. And well, I finished. If there are any questions. Guys, are you there?
Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation. One was really interesting, as Nicolas. And is there anyone who has any question? I pretty understood all you said, and I found it knowledgeable, interesting. But I don't have specific questions to ask you. But maybe I don't know if.
Sorry.
Anyone wants to ask a question. Let's see if there is anyone who wrote questions on YouTube. Let me check. YouTube. So nobody wants to ask any questions. I think we can stop here because Lira didn't show up yet, so probably she won't be able to join us for the forum. As always, please post your slides on the shared folder so that everyone can have another look at them. Thank you very much, Antonino. It was great.
Oh, thanks.
I don't know if
bye, guys.
I don't know if Pietro wants to close the forum. The president wants to close the forum. Let's see. Wait. Okay. Okay, guys. Pietro is not here today to close the forum. Probably he's listening to us, but I can't reach him. So we'll close today's meeting. Thank you very much for your participation, and thanks to all the conveners for their really knowledgeable and in-depth presentations. Hope we'll see all of you next week. As always, I will send you an email with all the information about where you can find today's YouTube video and about next week conveners presentations. Both the general argument, the general topic, and the names of the conveners. Thank you very much and goodbye. See you next week.